They liked to call themselves rational, modern, scientific, efficient. The men who built the Third Reich spoke the language of numbers, charts, and bureaucracy. They wore uniforms designed to look precise, cold, mathematical. They claimed they had stripped emotion from politics and replaced it with order. While the rest of the world clung to superstition, they said, Germany would be governed by logic. This was the image they sold to the outside world. It was also a lie, because beneath the paperwork, the statistics, and the stamped documents, the Nazi state was driven not by reason, but by belief. Not by science, but by myth. Not by facts, but by stories they invented, repeated, ritualized, and eventually began to obey. The most dangerous myths are not the ones told to children. They are the ones told to adults in uniforms. This is the story of those myths. Not ancient legends passed down through centuries, but modern legends, deliberately constructed in the 20th century by men with university degrees, state budgets, and absolute power. Myths designed to explain who deserved to live, who had to die, and why violence was not only necessary, but sacred. At the center of this myth-making machine stood the SS. Officially, the SS was an elite security force. In reality, it was something else entirely. It was an order, not a metaphorical one, but an order in the medieval sense. A brotherhood bound by ritual, blood symbolism, and a shared belief that they were chosen to reshape history itself. Its leader, Heinrich Himmler, did not see his men as soldiers. He saw them as priests of a new faith. And like all faiths, this one needed a mythology. Germany, in the aftermath of World War I, was fertile ground for myths. Defeat had shattered national pride. Economic collapse humiliated millions. Old certainties, monarchy, religion, empire, had failed. People were desperate for explanations that went deeper than politics. They wanted meaning, destiny, someone to blame. The Nazis offered all of it. They did not simply argue that Germany had been wronged. They claimed it had been betrayed. They did not say society was unequal. They said it was corrupted. They did not promise reform. They promised purification. And purification, in their worldview, was not a metaphor. It required blood. To justify that blood, the regime needed more than propaganda slogans. It needed an entire alternative history, a past that never existed, but felt ancient. A story in which Germans were not just a nation, but a biological and spiritual species. A story in which violence was not cruelty, but restoration. This was not improvised chaos. It was organized myth production. In 1935, while Germany passed the Nuremberg Laws and redefined citizenship through blood, the SS quietly expanded an institution called Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Research and Teaching Society. On paper, it studied archaeology and history. In practice, it existed to prove what the regime already believed, or more accurately, to invent proof. Ahnenerbe researchers searched for traces of an ancient Aryan civilization that supposedly ruled the world before being destroyed by racial mixing. They measured skulls. They collected folk tales. They traveled to Scandinavia, the Balkans, and even Tibet, convinced that somewhere, hidden in bones or myths, lay confirmation that Germans were descendants of a lost master race. This was not fringe eccentricity. This was state policy. At the same time, SS officers were taught that their marriages were acts of racial duty. Their children were not just offspring, but contributions to the future of humanity. Their enemies were not political opponents, but biological threats. Even language was reshaped. Killing became cleansing. Deportation became resettlement. Genocide became solution. Every myth served a function. The myth of the Aryan race explained why some lives mattered more than others. The myth of ancient Germanic warriors transformed murderers into knights. The myth of corrupted blood turned neighbors into parasites. The myth of destiny turned obedience into virtue. And above all, stood the myth of the leader. Adolf Hitler was not merely portrayed as a politician. He was framed as an instrument of fate, a man guided by intuition rather than reason, instinct rather than doubt. His survival during World War I, his rise from obscurity, even assassination attempts that failed, all were woven into a narrative of inevitability. In Nazi Germany, history did not unfold. It fulfilled itself. Once a society accepts that premise, facts become irrelevant. Contradictions are no longer problems. They are signs that outsiders do not understand. Evidence is not tested, it is filtered. Reality becomes flexible. This is why the Third Reich could build extermination camps, while insisting it was restoring civilization. Why it could destroy entire cultures while claiming to protect heritage. Why highly educated men could oversee industrial murder and still believe they were guardians of order. They were not pretending, they believed. That belief did not emerge by accident. It was cultivated deliberately through schools, ceremonies, architecture, and even holidays. SS recruits were subjected to rites that replaced Christian symbolism with pagan imagery. Weddings were redesigned, funerals were rewritten. The old moral universe was dismantled and replaced with a new one, where loyalty mattered more than conscience, and myth mattered more than truth. And here lies the most unsettling part of this story. The myths did not merely justify crimes after they happened. They actively shaped decisions before they were made. Military strategies were influenced by racial fantasies. Occupation policies were guided by imagined ancient borders. Scientific resources were wasted chasing legends, while real-world logistics collapsed. Entire populations were exterminated, not because they posed a threat, but because they contradicted the story. The Third Reich was not destroyed only by Allied armies. It was destroyed by its own mythology. By 1945, Germany was a nation in ruins. Its cities bombed, its economy shattered, its leadership dead or fleeing. The myths that once promised rebirth had demanded absolute sacrifice and delivered annihilation. But myths do not die easily. Some of these legends survived the collapse of the regime. They reappeared in conspiracy theories, extremist movements, and distorted popular culture. Others were quietly absorbed into post-war narratives that portrayed the Nazis as coldly rational monsters, stripped of belief, stripped of madness, stripped of myth. That version is comforting. It allows us to believe that intelligence is a safeguard, that education prevents atrocity, that myth belongs to the past. This series challenges that illusion. Because the men of the SS were not ignorant fanatics on the fringes of society. They were administrators, lawyers, engineers, historians. They built a modern state and infused it with ancient lies. What you are about to hear is not a collection of rumors or occult curiosities. It is a documented account of how a regime weaponized mythology, and how that mythology, once unleashed, began to rule its creators. This is not a story about what the Nazis told the world. It is a story about what they told themselves, and what happens when a state starts believing its own myths. The idea sounded ancient, scientific, undeniable. The Nazis did not present the Aryan race as a theory. They presented it as a fact so old that questioning it seemed foolish. In speeches, textbooks, posters, and SS training manuals, it appeared as something already proven, something discovered long ago and merely rediscovered by National Socialism. But the truth is far more disturbing. The Aryan race was not rediscovered. It was assembled, piece by piece, term by term, diagram by diagram, not by ancient peoples, but by modern ideologues searching for a justification to rule and destroy. The word Aryan did not originate in Germany at all. It came from 19th century linguistics, where scholars used it to describe a family of Indo-European languages. It referred to speech, not blood, grammar, not genes. It never described a biological race, let alone a master one. That inconvenient detail was quietly erased. By the early 20th century, racial theorists across Europe had already begun twisting linguistic categories into biological hierarchies. The Nazis inherited this intellectual wreckage and weaponized it. What had once been speculative, marginal, and controversial was transformed into state doctrine. By the time the Nazis seized power in 1933, Aryan no longer meant someone who spoke a related language. It meant someone who deserved to exist. The transformation was rapid and deliberate. School children were taught that history was a struggle between races, not ideas. Biology textbooks explained that character, intelligence, and morality were inherited through blood. Newspapers printed diagrams ranking humanity from creative races to parasitic ones. Museums hosted exhibitions where visitors compared skulls, noses, and eye angles. The message was relentless. Race explained everything. Economic collapse, racial sabotage, political opposition, racial degeneration, cultural diversity, racial decay. Once accepted, the concept required enforcement. This is where the SS entered the picture, not merely as enforcers, but as supposed guardians of racial truth. Under Heinrich Himmler, the SS transformed racial ideology into a lived system. Membership was not just about loyalty or combatability. It was about ancestry. Prospective SS men were required to submit genealogical records, tracing their lineage back to at least 1750. Marriages required approval. Children were counted as racial assets. The irony was impossible to ignore, except by those who believed the myth. Many SS officers failed their own standards. Physical traits varied wildly. Hair color, height, facial structure, none of it matched the idealized posters. Exceptions were constantly made. Files were altered, definitions quietly adjusted. The race had to exist. So reality bent to accommodate it. The Nazis claimed to follow science. In practice, they reversed the scientific method. Instead of forming hypotheses and testing them, they began with conclusions and demanded evidence be produced or invented to support them. Anthropology became theater. Researchers measured skulls with calipers, convinced that millimeters revealed destiny. Eye color charts were treated as moral maps. Even handwriting was examined for racial degeneracy. The data contradicted itself constantly, but contradictions were dismissed as contamination caused by racial mixing. When science failed, myth filled the gap. The Aryan was no longer merely a biological type. It became a moral and spiritual archetype. Aryans were said to be naturally creative, disciplined, heroic. They built civilizations. Others merely copied or corrupted them. This belief allowed the Nazis to claim ancient achievements across Europe, Asia, and even North Africa as Germanic in origin. Greek philosophy, Aryan; Roman law, Aryan; Indian civilization. Misguided Aryans led astray. History was stripped, looted, and repackaged. Institutions like Ahnenerbe were tasked with making this mythology appear scholarly. Archaeology was selectively interpreted. Myths were treated as evidence. Absence of proof was reframed as proof of suppression. Every civilization that contradicted the racial narrative had to be explained away or erased. But the most lethal function of the Aryan myth was not pride. It was exclusion. If Aryans were creators, then others were destroyers. If Aryans were builders, then others were parasites. If Aryans were destined to rule, then others were obstacles. This logic turned neighbors into threats and children into future enemies. By 1935, racial mythology had hardened into law. The Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of citizenship and reduced identity to blood fractions: half, quarter, eighth. These categories were biologically meaningless, but legally absolute. People became equations. Families became diagrams. The myth demanded precision, even when reality could not provide it. The Nazis understood something terrifyingly well. Myths do not need to be accurate. They need to be useful. The Aryan race explained why some Germans struggled despite working hard. It was the fault of hidden enemies. It explained why compassion was dangerous. It interfered with natural order. It explained why killing could be moral. It was not murder, but hygiene. Language followed accordingly. Killing became cleansing. Deportation became resettlement. Extermination became solution. The myth also provided emotional insulation. SS men were taught that empathy itself was a racial weakness. Doubt was contamination. Obedience was purity. To hesitate was to betray destiny. And destiny, according to the myth, was non-negotiable. What makes this chapter so unsettling is not merely that the Aryan race was false, but that it did not need to be true to function. It organized society, justified violence, and structured policy with ruthless efficiency. The Nazis did not discover a master race. They manufactured one, and then reorganized the world around it. By the late 1930s, belief in the Aryan myth had spread far beyond party elites. It shaped architecture, art, and family life. Mothers were praised not for raising children, but for producing racially valuable offspring. Soldiers were celebrated not for bravery, but for genetic worth. Human value was no longer individual. It was collective and hereditary. Once that line was crossed, mass murder became administratively simple. If a race never existed, then exterminating its supposed enemies could never fulfill its promise. The myth demanded constant escalation, new enemies, new purges, new sacrifices. The more violence it justified, the more violence it required. The Aryan race could never be complete. It could only be defended, forever. This was the paradox that consumed the regime. The myth that promised rebirth produced annihilation. The fantasy of purity generated endless impurity. The belief in superiority bred fear, fear of contamination, fear of decline, fear of reality. And yet, even as Germany collapsed under the weight of total war, the myth remained intact. In the final days of the Reich, orders were still issued in the language of racial destiny. Children were sent to die defending an idea that had never existed. The Aryan race was not defeated on the battlefield. It dissolved when confronted with reality. But myths do not vanish when exposed. They linger. They mutate. They wait for new believers. That is why this story matters. Because the first myth of the SS was not merely about race. It was about replacing truth with identity, and using that identity to decide who lives. And once that door is opened, history has shown how easily it can be opened again. The SS did not want to be seen as soldiers. Soldiers follow orders. Soldiers fight wars. Soldiers can be replaced. The SS wanted something else. They wanted to be chosen. From the very beginning, Heinrich Himmler imagined the SS not as a military unit, but as a brotherhood, an elite caste that would outlive the Third Reich itself. Armies could lose wars, states could collapse, but orders, bound by belief and ritual, could survive centuries. Himmler was obsessed with this idea. He read medieval chronicles, occult literature, pseudo-history, and racial theory with equal seriousness. In his mind, modern Germany had made a fatal mistake. It had abandoned myth in favor of reason. Christianity had weakened the warrior spirit. Liberalism had dissolved hierarchy. Democracy had erased destiny. The SS would correct that. Not by going backward, but by inventing a past powerful enough to rule the future. This is how the SS became an order. Not in a symbolic sense, but structurally, ideologically, and ritually. SS officers were taught that they were not merely protecting the state. They were guardians of a racial mission stretching back thousands of years. Their loyalty was not to law, parliament, or even the German people, but to an abstract idea of blood, destiny, and history. To make that believable, the SS needed ancestors. They found them in the Teutonic Knights. The medieval Teutonic Order had once ruled large parts of Eastern Europe, conducting crusades in the name of Christianity. The Nazis stripped away the Christian context and rebranded the knights as proto-racial warriors, Germanic conquerors who brought order to the East. This reinterpretation was deliberate. Eastern Europe, in Nazi ideology, was not simply territory. It was imagined as ancestral land that had been temporarily lost and needed to be reclaimed. The SS cast itself as the modern continuation of an ancient conquest, now framed not as religious war, but as racial destiny. The message was clear. What we are doing has been done before. What we are doing is history correcting itself. This myth allowed the SS to see mass murder not as a crime, but as a continuation. But myth alone was not enough. It had to be lived. This is where ritual entered the picture. SS recruits underwent ceremonies designed to replace traditional religion. Weddings were redesigned to emphasize blood and lineage rather than faith. Funerals abandoned Christian symbols in favor of runes, torches, and silence. Birthdays of SS men were treated as moments of racial accounting, the worth of the individual measured by ancestry and potential offspring. The most important of these rituals took place at a place that few Germans ever saw: Wewelsburg Castle. Located in Westphalia, Wewelsburg was not chosen for strategic reasons. It had no military value. Instead, Himmler envisioned it as the spiritual center of the SS, a kind of ideological Vatican for the new order. The castle was redesigned to reflect this role. At its core was a circular hall intended for SS leadership meetings, with symbolism carefully chosen to evoke eternity, unity, and sacrifice. Beneath it lay a crypt-like chamber, designed for ceremonies that were never fully documented, but heavily implied. The architecture itself was myth-making: circles, stone, fire, no crosses, no churches, no priests. The SS was building a religion without gods, but with destiny. Inside this system, rank was not merely bureaucratic, it was spiritual. Advancement in the SS was framed as proof of racial and moral worth. Failure was not incompetence, it was impurity. This distinction mattered. A soldier who deserts can be punished. A heretic must be destroyed. The SS myth deliberately blurred that line. By presenting themselves as an order, SS leaders removed the possibility of moral neutrality. You were either inside the circle, or you were a threat to it. There was no middle ground. This worldview reshaped how SS men saw violence. Killing was not an act of aggression. It was an act of preservation. The enemy was not human in the same moral sense. He was a disruption in the historical pattern. Eliminating him was framed as restoration, like removing rot from wood or disease from flesh. Language reinforced this constantly. Orders did not speak of people. They spoke of elements. Operations did not target families. They targeted structures. Massacres were framed as security measures. The SS myth of knighthood turned murder into duty, and duty into honor. And like all successful myths, it was flexible. When Christian institutions resisted Nazi authority, the SS portrayed Christianity as a foreign imposition that had weakened ancient Germanic strength. When convenient, medieval pagan imagery was emphasized. When inconvenient, it was ignored. Consistency did not matter. Function did. This is why the SS could simultaneously claim to represent ancient tradition and radical modernity. They were restoring a past that had never existed and using modern tools to enforce it. What made the order myth especially powerful was its internal logic. If the SS was a sacred brotherhood, then loyalty outweighed legality. If history was destiny, then mercy was betrayal. If purity was fragile, then constant violence was necessary. The myth did not simply justify crimes, it demanded them. By the late 1930s, SS leaders openly discussed the idea that their order would rule Europe long after the war. They imagined SS colonies in the East, governed by racial elites, with indigenous populations reduced to labor or eliminated entirely. This was not fantasy whispered in secret. It was planning. The SS believed they were laying the foundations of a 1,000-year structure. Law was temporary. Morality was conditional. Myth was permanent. And yet, beneath the ceremonies and symbols, the order was profoundly unstable. Because myths require constant reinforcement. Rituals had to be repeated. Enemies had to be identified. Blood had to be spilled. The SS could never relax. Peace would have exposed the emptiness at the center of the myth. Without struggle, without sacrifice, the idea of a sacred order would collapse. So the system escalated. More purges, more enemies, more violence. By the time the war turned against Germany, the SS did not abandon its mythology. It clung to it more desperately. Defeat was reframed as trial. Destruction as purification. Total collapse as proof that the world was unworthy of salvation. The order would rather see everything burn than admit it had been built on fiction. And this is the final irony of the SS myth. In trying to become knights of a fake past, they guaranteed a real future of ruin. They were not destroyed because they were irrational. They were destroyed because they believed their myth more than reality. In the next chapter, we will see how this belief hardened into something even more lethal, how myth moved from ceremony into biology, and how the SS transformed blood itself into a sacred weapon. At some point, myth stopped being metaphor. It stopped living in speeches, symbols, and ceremonies. It stopped hiding behind banners and rituals. And it entered the body. For the SS and the Nazi state, blood was not simply a biological substance. It was destiny, proof, verdict, a sacred code that defined who belonged to history and who had to be removed from it. Once blood was turned into law, there was no room left for doubt. The idea itself was not new. European anti-Semitism had long used the language of blood, lineage, and inheritance. But the Nazis radicalized it in a way no modern state ever had. They did not merely claim that blood mattered. They built an entire legal and administrative system around that claim. And the SS became its enforcers and priests. Under Heinrich Himmler, blood ideology was elevated to something almost mystical. Himmler spoke obsessively about purity, contamination, and inheritance. He believed that moral traits, loyalty, courage, creativity, were encoded biologically and transmitted through generations. To him, blood was memory. This belief required no evidence. It required obedience. By the mid-1930s, racial theory had moved from propaganda into governance. In 1935, the Nazi regime passed the Nuremberg Laws, which redefined German citizenship not by birthplace or loyalty, but by ancestry. For the first time in modern Europe, a person's legal rights depended on how many grandparents were classified as Jewish. Not beliefs, not actions. Blood. People were categorized as full Jews. Mischlinge of the first degree, Mischlinge of the second degree. These distinctions had no basis in biology. They were mathematical abstractions applied to human lives. A quarter, a half, an eighth. Human beings reduced to fractions. For the SS, these laws were not merely administrative tools. They were confirmation that myth had triumphed over reality. Blood was now measurable, registrable, enforceable. And once measured, it could be punished. The obsession with blood permeated everyday life. Marriage approvals required racial screening. Births were evaluated for genetic value. Family trees became legal documents. Ancestry research offices multiplied across Germany, staffed by bureaucrats trained to read genealogy as fate. The absurdity of the system was obvious, but irrelevant. Contradictions appeared immediately. Families were split by classifications that made no sense. Brothers were labeled differently. Veterans of World War I were stripped of rights despite lifelong service. Exceptions were quietly granted when the state needed expertise or loyalty. The myth bent when useful, but it never broke, because blood ideology was never about consistency. It was about control. The SS enforced this worldview with religious intensity. SS men were taught that their own blood carried responsibility, not privilege alone. Their marriages required approval. Their children were monitored. Their private lives were political. An SS man who married incorrectly was not just disobedient. He was betraying the future. Blood turned intimacy into ideology. This logic also allowed the regime to portray violence as necessity rather than cruelty. If blood carried corruption, then separation became hygiene. Deportation became quarantine. Murder became sanitation. The language was carefully chosen. Victims were not killed. They were removed. Communities were not destroyed. They were cleansed. Genocide was not extermination. It was a solution. The myth transformed mass murder into administrative routine. What made this system especially dangerous was its emotional appeal. Blood ideology offered simple explanations in a complex world. If society failed, it was not because of policy or chance, but because of contamination. If someone struggled, it was not misfortune, but biology. Responsibility disappeared. Guilt was reassigned. For SS officers overseeing deportations and killings, blood ideology provided psychological insulation. Victims were no longer individuals with faces and stories. They were carriers of an abstract threat. Eliminating them was framed as sacrifice for future generations. This was not blind hatred. It was structured dehumanization. The myth reached its most grotesque form in the regime's obsession with heredity and reproduction. Programs encouraged racially valuable women to bear children for SS men, whether married or not. The state praised fertility as patriotic duty. Motherhood became a biological contribution to the Reich. Children themselves were evaluated not as people, but as potential. The SS believed it was shaping humanity. At the same time, those deemed biologically unfit, the disabled, the mentally ill, the chronically sick, were targeted for elimination under programs that framed murder as mercy. Doctors signed off on deaths. Forms were stamped. Families were lied to. Blood ideology did not stop at race. It expanded to worth itself. The chilling efficiency of the system came from its internal coherence. Once blood was accepted as destiny, every action followed logically. If purity was fragile, then vigilance was required. If contamination was invisible, then suspicion was necessary. If biology was fate, then mercy was meaningless. And yet, beneath this apparent logic lay profound insecurity. The regime feared impurity precisely because it could never define purity. The Aryan ideal remained abstract, unreachable, always threatened. Every exception undermined the myth. Every real human body contradicted the diagram. So the system escalated. More rules, more categories, more violence. By the time the war began, blood ideology had become inseparable from military policy. Entire populations in Eastern Europe were designated as biologically inferior and therefore expendable. Occupation plans were drawn up not around governance, but around replacement. The SS envisioned a future in which German blood would colonize conquered lands, while local populations were reduced to labor, or erased entirely. This was not madness in the colloquial sense. It was consistency within a false premise. Once blood became destiny, extermination became policy. The most unsettling aspect of this chapter is not how extreme the ideology was, but how mundane it became. Clerks processed racial files. Teachers explained blood laws to children. Neighbors informed on neighbors. The myth functioned because it embedded itself in routine. Evil did not announce itself. It filed paperwork. By 1944, as Germany faced inevitable defeat, blood ideology did not weaken, it intensified. The regime blamed failure on impurity, betrayal, and insufficient commitment to racial principles. Reality was not evidence against the myth. It was proof that the world had not been cleansed enough. In the final months of the war, SS units continued mass killings even when military logic demanded retreat. Resources were diverted from defense to extermination. The myth demanded completion, even as the state collapsed. Blood had to be purified, no matter the cost. And so the myth consumed its creators. The belief that blood carried destiny did not save Germany. It destroyed it. It turned governance into ritual, science into theater, and murder into obligation. But like all powerful myths, it did not vanish with defeat. Fragments of blood ideology survived, rebranded, softened, hidden inside new narratives about culture, identity, and belonging. The language changed. The structure remained. That is why understanding this chapter matters. Because when blood replaces citizenship, when ancestry replaces responsibility, when biology replaces morality, violence becomes not just possible, but inevitable. In the next chapter, we will follow this myth beyond Europe, into the realm of fantasy disguised as research, where the SS searched for ancient origins in distant lands, convinced that somewhere, history itself would validate their blood-soaked beliefs. The myth was no longer satisfied with Europe. Once the SS had reimagined German history, once blood had become destiny, and violence had been reframed as duty, a new problem emerged. If the Aryan race was ancient, truly ancient, then traces of it should exist beyond modern borders. Somewhere in the world, the past itself had to confirm the story. And so the search began, not quietly, not symbolically, but with funding, uniforms, official mandates, and state authority. At the center of this effort stood Ahnenerbe, the SS institution tasked with proving that Nazi mythology was not ideology, but rediscovered truth. Its mission was not to explore the unknown, but to validate conclusions already drawn. Reality was expected to cooperate. The Ahnenerbe presented itself as a scholarly organization, employing archaeologists, linguists, historians, and ethnographers. In practice, it operated under a different logic. Research did not begin with questions. It began with answers, and demanded that evidence be found to support them. If evidence did not exist, it could be reinterpreted. If it could not be reinterpreted, it could be ignored. If it contradicted the myth, it was labeled suppression. This mindset allowed fantasy to masquerade as science. One of the most persistent obsessions was the idea of a lost primordial civilization, sometimes associated with Atlantis, sometimes with a vague northern homeland, that supposedly gave rise to the Aryan race. According to SS theorists, this civilization had once dominated the world before being destroyed by racial mixing and moral decay. The implication was clear. History was cyclical. Germany was not conquering, it was reclaiming. Atlantis itself was never seriously treated as metaphor. SS researchers discussed it as a physical place, submerged but real, whose descendants had spread across continents. Ancient ruins, myths, and symbols from wildly different cultures were cherry-picked and reassembled into a single narrative of Aryan dispersion. Contradictions were irrelevant. Similarity was enough. A spiral motif here, a sun symbol there, a vaguely similar word in an unrelated language. Pattern recognition replaced proof. But the most famous and revealing expression of this obsession was the SS expedition to Tibet. In 1938, an SS-sponsored team traveled to Central Asia with the explicit goal of finding traces of ancient Aryan origins. Tibet, in the SS imagination, was not simply remote, it was preserved. Isolated from modern corruption, a living archive of prehistory. The expedition was framed as scientific and diplomatic. In reality, It was myth hunting. SS researchers measured skulls, photographed faces, and collected cultural artifacts, convinced that physical features could confirm racial kinship. Tibetan culture was not studied on its own terms. It was mined for confirmation that Germans and Tibetans shared ancient ancestry. What they found did not matter. The expedition returned with data that contradicted Nazi racial assumptions. Tibetan features did not align with Aryan ideals. Cultural practices did not support the theory. Linguistic connections were speculative at best. The response was predictable. The data was reinterpreted. In SS reports, inconvenient details were reframed as evidence of degeneration caused by isolation or mixing. Anything that failed to support the myth was treated as deviation from an imagined original state. The conclusion never changed. Only the explanation did. This pattern repeated itself across continents. In Scandinavia, SS researchers exaggerated Viking heritage into a racial template. In the Balkans, ancient remains were selectively classified as Germanic. In Eastern Europe, Slavic cultures were portrayed as diluted offshoots of an earlier Aryan presence. Everywhere the SS looked, it saw itself. This was not exploration, it was projection. The deeper purpose of these expeditions was not academic. It was psychological and political. By embedding Nazi ideology in a deep, global past, the regime could present its ambitions as inevitable. Borders became temporary mistakes. Sovereignty became interruption. If Aryans had once ruled everywhere, then German expansion was restoration, not aggression. This logic had consequences. Occupation policies in Eastern Europe were shaped by these fantasies. Entire populations were deemed historically illegitimate. Recent arrivals who had displaced an older, superior race. Their removal was framed as historical correction. Colonization plans were justified not through strategy, but through myth. The SS imagined itself as a civilizational force, bringing order back to lands that had supposedly fallen into chaos after Aryan decline. Local cultures were not respected or negotiated with. They were overwritten. What made this phase especially dangerous was the confidence it generated. The SS no longer saw itself as experimenting. It believed it had uncovered truth suppressed by centuries of lies. Opposition was not disagreement. It was denial. This belief insulated the regime from reality. As the war intensified and resources dwindled, the Ahnenerbe continued to receive support. Expeditions persisted even as Germany faced catastrophic losses. Scientific fantasy was prioritized over military necessity. The myth demanded completion. Inside the SS, these ideas reinforced internal cohesion. Officers were not merely executing orders. They were participating in a grand historical mission. Their violence was reframed as archaeology of the future, clearing the ground for a reborn world. This mindset explains decisions that otherwise appear irrational. Why resources were diverted from defense to extermination. Why negotiations were rejected in favor of total destruction. Why retreat was treated as betrayal. The SS did not believe it was losing. It believed it was being tested. Every setback was interpreted as evidence that the world was corrupt, unworthy, or insufficiently purified. Failure did not disprove the myth. It intensified it. And this is the core danger of state-sponsored mythology. When belief replaces evidence, defeat becomes heresy. When history becomes destiny, compromise becomes treason. When fantasy governs policy, reality becomes disposable. By 1945, the SS myth of ancient origins lay in ruins alongside the cities of Europe. The Atlantean past never surfaced. The Tibetan connection dissolved. The archaeological proofs collapsed under scrutiny. But the damage was done. Millions had been killed in the name of a past that never existed. Entire cultures had been destroyed to make room for an imagined ancestry. Science had been hollowed out and repurposed as ritual. The SS did not find history. It replaced it. In the next chapter, we turn inward again, to the most powerful myth of all. Not a race, not an order, not an ancient civilization, but a man. A leader transformed into destiny itself. Every myth needs a center, a symbol strong enough to hold contradictions together, a figure capable of absorbing failure, doubt, and fear, and transforming them into belief. For the Third Reich, that figure was Adolf Hitler. Hitler was not merely presented as a leader, he was framed as inevitability, a man who did not shape history, but fulfilled it. His authority did not rest on institutions or law, but on intuition, instinct, and fate. This distinction mattered. A politician can be questioned. A commander can be replaced. But destiny cannot be argued with. The myth of Hitler as the chosen one did not appear fully formed. It evolved, carefully, deliberately, over years of propaganda, ritual, and repetition. Early portrayals emphasized his humility and sacrifice. Later ones emphasized his infallibility. By the late 1930s, Hitler was no longer depicted as human in the ordinary sense. He was Germany incarnate. This transformation was not accidental. It was engineered by the Nazi propaganda apparatus and embraced enthusiastically by the SS, which understood that loyalty to a man was easier to enforce than loyalty to an idea. The Führer myth solved a central problem of totalitarian rule: uncertainty. In a system built on constant mobilization and permanent crisis, doubt was dangerous. Debate slowed action. Complexity weakened obedience. The solution was simple: present decisions not as choices, but as revelations. Hitler did not decide. He recognized what history demanded. Failures were reframed as trials, successes as proof of destiny. Even mistakes were absorbed into the myth. When policies backfired, blame was shifted downward, onto disloyal officials, insufficiently committed subordinates, or hidden enemies. The Führer was always right. If reality disagreed, reality was wrong. This belief penetrated every level of the state. Bureaucrats waited for the Führer's will rather than written orders. Officials competed to anticipate what Hitler would have wanted. The absence of clear directives became a feature, not a flaw. It allowed radicalism to flourish. The SS thrived in this environment. Its leaders understood that proximity to the Führer myth was power. They presented themselves as the purest interpreters of Hitler's vision, unburdened by law, compromise, or restraint. Violence escalated, not because Hitler micromanaged it, but because his myth encouraged initiative and cruelty. To act ruthlessly was to prove loyalty. To hesitate was to betray destiny. The cult of the Führer also replaced traditional religion. Nazi ceremonies borrowed religious structures, processions, hymns, sacred dates, but stripped them of theological content. Faith was redirected away from God and toward the state, embodied in one man. Hitler's speeches were treated as revelations. His survival of assassination attempts was framed as divine protection. His intuition was celebrated over expertise. Rational planning was often dismissed as weakness. The regime did not deny reality. It subordinated it. This mindset had profound consequences for decision-making. Military strategies were influenced by Hitler's personal convictions rather than logistical assessments. Warnings from generals were ignored if they contradicted his vision. Retreat was seen as moral failure rather than tactical necessity. As the war turned against Germany, the Führer myth did not weaken, it intensified. Defeat was explained not as strategic error, but as insufficient faith. Resources were diverted into symbolic projects, while front lines collapsed. Entire cities were sacrificed because surrender contradicted the narrative of destiny. The myth demanded total commitment, up to and including annihilation. This explains one of the most chilling aspects of the final years of the Reich, the willingness to destroy Germany itself rather than admit the myth was false. Infrastructure was sabotaged. Civilians were abandoned. Children were mobilized. If the nation could not fulfill destiny, it was deemed unworthy of survival. In this sense, the Führer myth was not merely authoritarian. It was apocalyptic. It framed the world in absolute terms: victory, or purification through destruction. Compromise had no place. Survival without myth was meaningless. The SS internalized this logic completely. By the end of the war, SS units continued mass killings even when they had no strategic value. The myth of destiny overrode every other consideration. Reality had lost authority. And this is the final danger of personal myth-making at the level of the state. When a leader becomes destiny, morality dissolves. Law becomes optional. Violence becomes proof of belief. The Führer myth did not require Hitler to be omnipotent. It required others to act as if he were. That collective surrender of responsibility is what turned myth into catastrophe. In the next chapter, we will see how the SS extended this logic backward in time, recasting history itself as a story of victimhood and revenge, by inventing one of its strangest legends: the myth of the witches. Every ideology that claims absolute truth eventually needs a past filled with victims. Not victims of its own violence, but victims whose suffering can be reinterpreted, repurposed, and weaponized. For the SS, that past was found not only in imagined Aryan empires or lost civilizations, but in something far more unexpected: witches. In the 1930s, while the Nazi regime was preparing for war and building extermination camps, parts of the SS devoted serious time and resources to the study of early modern witch trials. Thousands of documents were collected. Archives were examined. Names, dates, and execution records were catalogued. This was not historical curiosity. It was ideological reconstruction. Under the direction of Heinrich Himmler, the SS promoted a radical reinterpretation of witch hunts. According to this narrative, the women executed as witches between the 15th and 18th centuries were not victims of superstition or social panic. They were portrayed as bearers of ancient Germanic knowledge, healers, priestesses, guardians of pre-Christian Aryan wisdom. Their execution, the SS claimed, was not random hysteria. It was genocide, but not their genocide. The blame was shifted outward, toward Christianity, the Church, and in more conspiratorial versions of the myth, toward Jewish influence over Christian institutions. The witch hunts were reframed as a deliberate attempt to destroy the spiritual core of the Aryan people. History was turned into accusation. This myth served several purposes at once. First, it positioned the SS as heirs to a suppressed tradition. If ancient Aryan wisdom had been destroyed by outsiders, then the SS was not creating something new. It was restoring what had been stolen. Second, it justified hostility toward Christianity. Although the Nazi regime never fully abolished the Church, many SS leaders viewed Christianity as alien, weak, and incompatible with racial ideology. By portraying the Church as the executioner of Aryan women, the SS cast itself as a force of historical justice. And third, it reframed violence as revenge. The logic was simple and dangerous. They killed our women. We are only answering history. To support this narrative, SS researchers compiled extensive card indexes of witch trial victims. Tens of thousands of names were recorded. The suffering was real. The reinterpretation was not. The women accused of witchcraft came from vastly different backgrounds, regions, and social classes. Their executions were driven by local conflicts, economic tensions, religious fears, and legal structures. Not racial genocide. But nuance was irrelevant. The SS did not study the witch trials to understand them. It studied them to claim them. In SS publications, witches were stripped of individuality and recast as symbols. Their alleged healing practices were exaggerated. Their supposed pagan beliefs were projected backward without evidence. Christianity was reduced to a monolithic enemy. The myth was not about women. It was about legitimacy. By claiming ancient persecution, the SS portrayed itself as a movement correcting historical injustice. Its own brutality became part of a cosmic balance, violence answering violence across centuries. This inversion was critical. The perpetrators cast themselves as heirs of victims. The victims of the present were framed as historical aggressors. Moral roles were reversed. This myth also allowed the SS to present its ideology as defensive. The regime was not attacking society. It was protecting itself from forces that had supposedly destroyed Aryan culture before, and would do so again if not stopped. Fear replaced responsibility. Once again, myth did the work that facts could not. The witch narrative blended seamlessly with other SS beliefs. Pagan symbolism was emphasized. Christian holidays were replaced or reframed. Rituals borrowed imagined elements of ancient Germanic worship. The SS aesthetic became increasingly detached from historical reality and increasingly invested in invented tradition. What mattered was not accuracy, but emotional resonance. The image of innocent women burned by hostile forces created a powerful sense of grievance. It allowed SS members to see themselves as participants in a long, righteous struggle, rather than as agents of contemporary oppression. And yet, the irony was grotesque. While the SS mourned fictionalized victims of historical violence, it orchestrated real, systematic murder on an industrial scale. The empathy extended backward in time was denied entirely in the present. This selective compassion was not hypocrisy. It was design. Myths are not meant to make people humane. They are meant to make violence feel meaningful. The witch myth reached its peak influence in SS intellectual circles, but its symbolic power echoed throughout the regime. It reinforced the idea that history itself was a battlefield, and that moral restraint was weakness. By reframing persecution as ancestral trauma, the SS created a moral loophole large enough to swallow genocide. The past became a weapon, and like all weapons built on myth, it was dangerously unstable. The more the SS invested in imaginary grievances, the more it needed enemies to justify them. History could never be settled. Revenge could never be complete. The myth demanded permanence. In the final years of the war, as Germany collapsed, this worldview intensified. Destruction was no longer failure, it was purification. If the world rejected the SS vision, then the world deserved to burn. This is where myth reveals its true cost. It does not merely distort the past, it imprisons the present, and it demands blood from the future. In the final chapter, we will confront the most persistent illusion of all, the belief that the Nazi system was ultimately rational, efficient, and coldly logical. Because that too was a myth. After the war, the world searched for explanations. The scale of the crimes committed by Nazi Germany was so vast, so systematic, so meticulously organized, that many observers reached a disturbing conclusion. This must have been the result of cold rationality, of efficiency taken to its extreme, of a modern state applying logic without morality. This explanation was comforting. If evil was rational, then it could be managed. If it was bureaucratic, then it was impersonal. If it followed rules, then it was predictable. But this, too, was a myth. One of the most persistent legends surrounding the Third Reich is the idea that it was governed by reason, that behind the uniforms and paperwork stood a machine driven by calculation rather than belief. In reality, the bureaucracy did not restrain madness. It served it. The Nazi system was not a triumph of rational planning. It was a chaotic structure held together by ideology, myth, and competition for favor. Overlapping authorities issued contradictory orders. Laws were vague by design. Responsibility was deliberately blurred. What appeared efficient from the outside was internally unstable. The SS thrived in this environment. Its power grew not because it followed rules, but because it exploited ambiguity. SS leaders did not need explicit instructions to escalate violence. They operated within a worldview that rewarded radical interpretation. This is where myth completed its work. The bureaucracy provided forms, transport schedules, and filing systems. Myth provided meaning. Without ideology, the paperwork would have stalled. Without belief, the machinery would have jammed. Instead, it accelerated. The genocide of European Jews did not unfold because every step was logically optimized. It unfolded because the system rewarded those who acted most decisively in accordance with ideological expectations. Officials who hesitated were sidelined. Those who escalated were promoted. The process was competitive. Who could solve the problem faster? Who could remove obstacles more thoroughly? Who could demonstrate the greatest commitment? This was not rational administration. It was ideological improvisation. Even at the height of the war, decisions were shaped by fantasy. Trains were diverted from military use to transport deportees. Resources desperately needed at the front were consumed by extermination infrastructure. Killing continued, even when it actively undermined Germany's chances of survival. From a strategic perspective, this made no sense. From a mythological one, it made perfect sense. The Nazi worldview had redefined success. Victory was no longer measured by territory held or enemies defeated, but by ideological purity achieved. Destruction itself became proof of commitment. The more desperate the situation became, the more violently the system doubled down. This is why the final months of the war were among the most lethal. As defeat became inevitable, the regime did not seek to preserve life or negotiate survival. It sought completion. If the myth could not be fulfilled, then it would end in annihilation. Reality had lost its authority. This is the point at which the myth of rational evil collapses entirely. There was nothing rational about destroying one's own future in the name of an imagined past. There was nothing efficient about sacrificing everything to an idea that could never be satisfied. What sustained the system was not logic. It was belief. Belief that history had a direction. Belief that blood carried destiny. Belief that violence purified. Belief that obedience absolved responsibility. Bureaucracy did not replace conscience. It anesthetized it. Paperwork created distance. Distance created detachment. Detachment made atrocity survivable for those committing it. The myth did the rest, transforming participation into duty and doubt into weakness. After 1945, many perpetrators claimed they were merely following orders, acting within a system larger than themselves. This defense misunderstands the nature of the regime. The system did not force belief. It rewarded it. Those who rose within it did so not because they were efficient clerks, but because they embraced the myths most fully. They internalized them. They acted on them without hesitation. This is why the focus on bureaucracy alone is misleading. Forms and schedules do not generate genocide. Ideas do. Stories do. Myths do. The Third Reich was not destroyed because its myths were disproven. It was destroyed because they demanded everything and gave nothing back. And yet, the most uncomfortable truth remains. The myths themselves did not die in 1945. They fragmented. They resurfaced in new forms, less explicit, less centralized, but still recognizable. Narratives about blood, destiny, civilizational struggle, and historical revenge continue to appear wherever complexity becomes unbearable and identity offers an easy answer. That is why this story matters now. Because the danger was never confined to Germany. It was never confined to the 20th century. And it was never confined to one ideology. The lesson of the SS is not that myth is evil. It is that myth becomes lethal when it replaces reality, absolves responsibility, and demands obedience. The men who built this system did not believe they were villains. They believed they were custodians of truth in a corrupt world. And that belief, more than any weapon, any law, or any uniform, is what turned myth into murder.